The Russia-Ukraine conflict is really not all that complicated to talk about outside of the Western purview, but we do need to discuss some things that help bring this into better understanding. One of the things that we need to understand is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, which was formed by the United States and its Western allies to combat the, quote, growing evils of communism and make sure that the Soviet Union did not spread its influence around areas that would interfere with the commerce and trade of the Western Front. What it's been used for since then is the United States to impose its will throughout the entire world. Now, a lot of times this can mean different things, but when it pertains to Russia-Ukraine, there were rumors of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, Noam Chomsky, in an interview with a Thorough Conversations podcast of 2022 or 2023, when it was released, I'll put it in the description, gave a metaphor of imagine if China and BRICS, or a more militarized version of BRICS, because BRICS is not really militarized the same way NATO is, invited Mexico to join this opposition and aggressive military organization to the United States. How do you think the United States would act towards Mexico? This is essentially the reasoning behind Putin's aggression in Ukraine. Now, with that being said, I have to also say clearly that what's going on in Ukraine is terrible, and the loss of life and bombardments and war crimes that are surely happening are not justifiable and terrible, but you have to also look at them from a different point of view. And that point of view is that the Western media is not telling you the full story. So that is part of it. It's also worth noting that NATO was supposed to not go further east past Germany after the fall of the Soviet Union. But that was quickly forgot about, and places further east than that have joined NATO without any problem. And ongoing since then, especially since Vladimir Putin, who when he came into office in Russia, was a friend of the United States, even really wanted to join NATO and said, let us be part of your trade agreement and alliance. Let's work together and whatnot. Now, you'd think this would make common sense considering the United States is always, quote unquote, trying to find diplomacy with our enemies across the world, but that's not really ever true, or evidence really combats that fact. So as the United States and NATO spread its influence and more nations were on the Eastern Front growing, Russia continued to threaten and raise tensions in response to that. Whether or not the United States always thought that Putin and the Russian government were bluffing, or that they would never actually declare war or invade a place like they have with Ukraine, we don't know. But what we do know is that the country of Russia has now, for a number of days, it's well over 1,000, has waged a destructive war on the Ukraine, killing thousands, if not tens of thousands, at this point. Before we go any further with the current day events, we have to also understand the United States' influence in the Ukraine itself, which the United States has had a heavy hand in that, particularly going into the Obama administration when the Assistant Secretary of State had a leaked phone call by WikiLeaks. This will be in the description as well. An article describing the call as well as the actual call itself will be there, in which they were describing who they want in the Ukrainian government. When Ukraine was involved in a civil war in between several different forces, the people who are currently in charge have a history of neo-Nazism. The United States, repeatedly did what they have done across the world, and we'll discuss again whenever it comes to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and fought against peaceful settlements until they got what they wanted, which was who they wanted to see in power. All that being said, here we are. The year is 2025. Russia is still bombarding Ukraine. At this point, Russia has about 30% of Ukrainian territory that it has gotten since the war has started. Which leads us to our next point of this video that is very important, that the Western media has not done a great job of telling you, because they really want you to think that the United States and its European allies, who have been working so hard to deliver billions of dollars of weapons to the Ukraine, have been doing great in supporting the war, and Ukrainians have been, quote, holding their own, or even in some cases, winning small battles. Ukraine has not been winning this war or holding its own at all. It has been utterly devastated since day one. It is absolutely tragic. It is, quite frankly, saddening that so many people have lost their lives, especially when we get into the reasons that they have lost their lives here in a second. It's just one of those things that we see time and time again. There are outside interests in this small country that have been making sure that this war continues and escalates, and innocent lives have been lost. And here in the United States, you'll read the New York Times or other articles, and they'll say things like, Ukraine now managing another front, or Ukraine has now started to move into Russian territory. And the outside world, the realistic world, says, what are you doing? Why are you continuing to try this? Because even if you do put what small amount of soldiers you now have over there, you're still losing all of these other places all the time. Now, with the understanding of the tragic loss of human life and Russia's aggression, as well as condemnable actions in the Ukraine, understood, we now can move forward to things that have happened since the beginning of this conflict. One of which was about 6 or 7 months into the conflict, the Turkish government attempted to get a treaty formed between the Ukraine and Russia. Now, Russia was all ready to go ahead and let it go, and the Ukraine was all ready to, of course, accept it as well, since they're being damaged so badly, and Russia didn't really want to spend as much money and effort and resources as it had begun to spend. We don't know this, or as well as what was 100% said there, but what we do know was because of the British and American interference in these treaties, the Ukrainian government pushed away any sort of negotiations with the Russian government and continued on this conflict. And since then, they have begun being absolutely decimated. The American government, which has become a major issue here in the United States, is why we're sending so much money to the Ukraine. Donald Trump, during his campaign, repeatedly rallied around the ideas of why are we sending monies to this, and on my first day in office, this will be a done deal. The United States and its allies have sent weapons, including recently upping its weapons into long-range missiles that can reach into Russia and attack inside of Russia, of course. As we have now seen, there has been an attack like that, and Russia shot down all the missiles. But the United States and its allies have been upping the weaponry sent into the Ukraine for them to use against Russian soldiers. It has been quoted and said very many times by different officials that the United States is happy to keep this war going as long as it will go, and they will fight it until the last Ukrainian. This is a deplorable idea, but it is just true. The entire world at this point, and a lot of Americans are even starting to see that this is just a proxy war, that the United States is just draining Russia of its resources and military while propping up this small little country that can't possibly withstand this amount of damage for very much longer. And Europe has also paid a heavy cost, as we'll get into in a minute too. So, as the years have gone on and this war has continued, at first you may remember in the United States, people were all rallying around the Ukrainians. Everyone was all about not letting this aggression and unwarranted, disgusting actions by the Russian government occur. And so you'll probably still see people with stickers on their cars, their houses, flags, and your offices of the little Ukrainian flag, not knowing the whole side of the story about what's really going on, which, once again, Russia's actions are completely deplorable. But as I said earlier, how exactly would we react if China suddenly entered into a military alliance with Mexico, or they were even rumored to do that? We know how they would react, or the United States would. We've seen it time and time again when countries do things that we don't agree with. We just discussed a month or so ago in Vietnam. the Vietnamese government was going to put in place a government that the United States was not agreeable to. So we utterly destroyed Vietnam, and then in 1964 we invaded. Now, that all being understood, we move forward into the more trade and monetary sort of things. After the war began, the Biden administration announced what was called the mother of all sanctions against Russia and said that, in quote, their ruble will be worth nothing, their economy will collapse, and they will not be able to keep this war up for longer than a month. I guess the Biden administration just is stuck in its own bubble, as a lot of the United States is, and they have failed to see what a lot of people are saying is a losing and failing of an empire. And quite frankly, that's beginning to seem more and more true, as they just didn't realize that the BRICS organization was a thing. Now, a couple weeks ago, during my first ever Let Us Talk video, I brought up the idea that not a lot of people in the United States know what BRICS is. So let's go ahead and discuss what BRICS is. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a trade agreement that now involves at least 20 other nations and is growing every day. It is filled with nations from the global south who have been on the receiving end of the United States' government's quote-unquote diplomacy, as we have talked about with the Reagan administration and the Carter administration last week and the Vietnam invasion, and we'll discuss onward with more videos as we get into it. But BRICS is set up to help out other nations when they're in situations like this, much like the so-called alliances in NATO or NAFTA. So what happened was the Biden administration announced all these sanctions, and it also demanded that Europe and all of the other nations of the world also take part in these sanctions as well. What happened was Britain, which is now a virtual satellite of the United States, and France and other European nations gladly said, absolutely, we'll do these sanctions and we'll stop buying cheap oil from Russia, which is Russia's main export. Now, since then, American oil companies have made about $200 billion off of the Ukrainian war. Since Russia is no longer selling to Europe, Europe has to buy its oil somewhere. So Europe has now looked to the United States, who sells it at about 2 or 4 times as much as Russia would sell it. Russia, on the other hand, you might notice their economy has not collapsed. Their ruble lost about 20% of its value at the beginning of the conflict, but has bounced back and is currently doing just fine outside of the loss of life. Is okay because India, who has a growing economy that is growing about double the rate of the United States if you look at GDP, and China, who is also growing a little more than double the rate of the United States' GDP, said, hey, we will buy your exports if you use the money that we buy to buy our exports. For China, it was mainly electric vehicles, which are not being sold in the United States because of a 100% tariff that we have here that was implemented by the Biden administration. So whenever Donald Trump is talking about all these tariffs he's going to put on China, just remember the Biden administration was the administration that just upped the tariffs that Trump had implemented in his first administration. So because of this, the Russian economy is doing, for the most part, fine. They are losing a lot of military value because of this ongoing conflict. But Ukraine is being utterly decimated. Europeans' economy, Germany, France, the UK, they are falling and failing and becoming utterly devastated because of this. And the United States economy, while the top 1%, top 10% who own the oil fields and own the investments in military firms are making a bunch of money, the middle class and lower class of the United States are still suffering. These are things we're going to talk about later, but it's important to note all of this and how it pertains to the Ukrainian conflict. So, from there, let us go ahead and talk about the scariest part of this war and something that has been a major problem because of the United States for the last century or so. And this is the ongoing threat of the number 2 way of destroying the planet, nuclear war. The United States and its allies have been upping their weapons and sending them into Ukraine to fight Russia. Most recently, it was the missiles that could reach into Russia from the Ukraine. And there was one attack that Russia stopped, but there surely could be more as long as this war goes on. The United States and Russia had a nuclear arms treaty called New START that had agreed upon the, not launching nukes at each other. And since the Ukrainian conflict has escalated, Russia suspended their participation in this treaty, and because of the recent missiles that have been agreed to launch into Russia from Ukraine supplied by the United States, Russia has also lowered its qualifications for launching a full-blown nuclear attack. This also gets into when people talk about going to war with China as well, but mostly people in our government, but also a lot of people and just regular voters and citizens in the United States don't seem to have an understanding of what will happen if the nuclear weapons are launched. So I'm just going to give you a brief rundown on even if just one nuclear strike happens with the capabilities that we know we have now in the modern year 2025. One strike could lead to the entirety of the world and organized life as we know it ending. One of the things that people talk about a lot, and one of the theories about how the dinosaurs died out, was a comet hit the Earth. Now, the comet's impact was not what killed all the dinosaurs. What killed all the dinosaurs was the rising debris from that blocked out the sun. This is the same thing that happens in nuclear fallout, as well as power grids go down. Power grids meaning electricity, things that human beings can no longer live without in the year 2025, things that are basic human rights, basic plumbing, your car, anything. Nuclear war is the end of the world. And the fact that people are realistically saying that we could have this sort of war with China, or more likely in the immediate future, Russia, is terrifying. That's basically the gist of it. That's how we got here where we are now. I can see Trump because of his relationship with Putin, whatever you want to say it is. I could see him definitely leading to the end of the Ukrainian conflict. That would be really nice. Listen, not a lot of people have been watching the presidential administration videos, but I did upload a video on Jimmy Carter last week, and there's also a video on Ronald Reagan. If you want to know about why you should not be a big fan of a president, no matter what little letter they have by their name whenever they are elected, go watch those videos. Secondly, next week's video will be a Let Us Talk, since it's the inauguration week, just a general aspect of where the world is. And during that video, and it'll probably be pretty commonplace for these videos, I will talk about Israel-Palestine and the ceasefire. I'm not going to talk about it a lot right now. I am just going to say, even though the ceasefire has been agreed upon by the majority of the parties, Hamas has agreed to it, Israel is still trying to figure out, as of today, if they're going to agree to it or not. Supposedly it'll be implemented in full by Sunday, but Israel is still killing civilians. At least 30 children have died in the last 5 days because of these strikes. Please go to the United States Campaign for Palestinian Rights and donate, take action. The Biden administration is getting ready, as it leaves office this week, has sent $8 billion of weapons into Israel, even though they're getting ready to sign a peace treaty, and so on and so forth. There will also be the World Food for Gaza in the description below, as well as all the links of things I talked about. This video was a little off the rails, a little more how I talk about these things when I talk about with my friends. Probably how I'm going to talk about these videos in the future. If you would like me to go back to the way I was doing these videos, with more of a lecture and less of a conversation, please let me know. Be happy to do that. Thank you so much for watching. Next week is Let Us Talk number 2, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.